Alesha Black is going to moderate two conversations. One is looking back, one is looking forward. Let's start with looking back. Alesha, please bring on your panel. Hello, panel. Look at this knowledge bank of wisdom.
That's right.
Fantastic. Alesha, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're going to do a little bit of reflection and hopefully a little bit of looking forward, and I bet the panels will mix a little bit. I have the great fortune of working with these three gentlemen pretty closely, and indeed there is a lot of wisdom here for us to pull out. And I wanted to start by kind of framing up, this is our 10th anniversary. A lot has happened in 10 years, and we think of the council as a place where we host a community and a conversation. But we've also done some very specific work, some specific reports, taken some very specific decisions in order to move this work forward. And Dan and Doug have been part of a lot of that and can kind of tell the story of how how the council's work has unfolded. And so I want to start with Dan. Dan, just thinking about both what we've done here at the council and also you're part of a broader community of people working on global development, on global food security. What do we have to be particularly proud of, and where have we fallen a bit short?
Well, I think that, first of all, thank you for having us. Thanks to my friend Ivo and my partner Doug. Thanks also to Marshall Bouton and Catherine Bertini, who kind of were the inspiration for this effort. So here's what the council has done. When we started 10 years ago, I can frankly say global food security was not at the top of the global agenda. It wasn't a part of the G20, it wasn't a part of the G7, it wasn't a part of the G anything. I mean, people would talk about it, but oftentimes food and agriculture issues were relegated to secondary issues by policymakers all over the world. This weren't at the top of the list. We helped change that through our initial report, where we basically called for a new initiative which created the Feed the Future initiative, which our council largely inspired. And then we went on to deal with such issues as how government deals with these issues, nutrition, women in agriculture, youth bulge, a whole variety, research, a whole variety of things. But elevating that issue, so now it's on people's minds. They talk about it. It's important. We now have prime ministers and presidents talking not just about national security issues in a linear way, but talking about security issues which involve food and agriculture and health and nutrition. That was a big part of what this organization did, and it's really, really important. And we've also elevated it so it's not just the government, but it's the private sector, it's smallholder farmers, it's consumers, it's academics, it's NGOs. Everybody's in this space now. It's kind of sexy to be in the food space. And I think that's really important. So that's great. And it's also been bipartisan, which I think my colleague Doug may talk about a little bit. It's one of the few issues that is bipartisan. I think the thing that worries me the most, and it's not something we haven't done, is that we have to stay engaged as a country. So I know there are people here from a lot of different countries. And I'll just say from the standpoint of the United States of America, America, which is disengaged in terms of the rest of the world on any issue, is disengaged across the board in almost every issue. And in the area of food security, it's really important for this country to stay involved in the world. And historically, our major involvement in the world, other than national security issues, was in humanitarian assistance, food assistance, development assistance. That's the biggest challenge for us to go forward, I think.
To stay engaged.
Sustained engagement.
Yeah. Doug, I'm going to go to you next. I've learned a lot from you and Dan about how to talk about the issues that we're talking about, not just to talk about food security, but to talk about it linked to other issues like national security, like economic opportunity. I would love for you to talk about how do you build nonpartisan support or bipartisan support for an issue like this?
Well, I think Marshall and the people that worked with him initially in 2008 were very careful to make sure that the task forces were bipartisan, that there were representatives there that would get the white paper to the two parties' national conventions, to give it to the Obama campaign, to give it to the McCain campaign. And that has continued. So that bipartisan effort means that it is that way on the Hill today. I think that something very interesting has happened after the initial effort by President Obama and taking it to the G20 and the G8. Congress has fully engaged in this issue. I think they've taken ownership of it, which is really good. We always depend upon good people in the executive branch for the support and for the good work that they do, but Congress now considers it their own. And that leads you to kind of major successes like the recent 5-year reauthorization of the Global Food Security Act. And they've noticed that this is good politics as well. And there are a broad number of organizations that come and work and ask their senator or their House member, please support this, it's important. And it includes certainly the agriculture community in this country. It includes people that are interested in ag research at our land grant and other institutions. It includes the National Security Coalition too. You can see them speaking out on this issue. So I think that's what has helped build the success that we've had on Capitol Hill, and I expect that to continue. It does mean that there will be oversight. There should be oversight, but it's going to be, I think, positive to make sure that things are working. You happen to have a USAID administrator who's our former colleague from Wisconsin, and his experience, I think, as ambassador to Tanzania is very reassuring to people. They'll look at whether the reforms and organization in USAID make sense, but the oversight there is going to be positive to make sure this is working well, because the Congress wants it to work well.
Great, thank you. Ivo, you come from outside the food security community, but you are very much in the conversation about U.S. engagement in the world. Could you talk about Dan's comment about the risk of disengagement, and also how we should be thinking about that vis-a-vis other powers in the world?
Yes, I mean, when you look at the last 70 years or so about what has happened in the world in terms of the big issues, the U.S. has led both on the big mistakes, whether it's Vietnam or the Iraq War, and it's led on the big successes, one of which is food security. It was the U.S. that had to put it on the agenda. And then others were coming to that discussion and would take the agenda forward. But in every important step, whether it was in Aquila in 2009, 10 years ago, when the issue first really came on the G8 agenda, or later in the G20, and in 2012 when the president again, then President Obama, again put it on the agenda, both the G8 and the G20, to make sure that an issue like this had the full backing of the United States, and others then would become part and parcel of that discussion. And if you look at the history of the last 70 years, as is when you're trying to figure out how do you get a collection of nations to act, you need someone to start priming the pump, someone who makes the case and brings others along, called leading. And leading means you have people who follow you. And the United States has been very successful in doing this. And I think if you look at the work that we have done in the Chicago Council, we help bring this issue to the fore in both the executive and the congressional branches, as Dan and Doug just explained. But then we also try to make clear that this is an issue that needs to go well beyond the United States. It's not something that we can do by ourselves. It has to be an issue that everyone takes very seriously. And so you do start to worry if and when there is a sense that the United States is retreating from some of those obligations, that these issues are no longer as central in American foreign engagement, and indeed American foreign engagement isn't as central as it used to be about what is the future of this effort. Is it sufficiently enshrined in the now G7 and the G20 that it has taken on a momentum of its own? To some extent, the answer to that is yes. To some extent, other countries have become the kind of advocates for these kinds of issues that you would like to see. But it will need pushes, and it will need new ideas, and it will need the kind of leadership that the U.S. has provided in the past. And if that leadership is no longer forthcoming, it is a reason for worry.
Dan, you and I participated in a symposium with the Japanese government not too long ago. And in fact, they talked about the importance of U.S. leadership as well. And I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on that conversation and how you travel a lot, you do congressional delegations elsewhere. What do you hear from others about U.S. leadership?
Well, with respect to Japan, they've become very big contributors to global humanitarian relief, as have a lot of countries. And although we still are the largest contributor, I think, individual contributor to the World Food Program, but everywhere you go, they really are looking at American leadership I think that is really, really important. And our role, whether it's in multilateral institutions or in the U.S. Congress or with the private sector, it's significant. I did want to mention one thing that we talked just briefly about, which is a little bit off this question, but
Sure.
you know, politics is so much involved in everything we're talking about today.
Yes.
And I haven't heard too much about politics. That just doesn't mean partisan politics in this country. It means politics inside countries, between countries, and everything else. And politics is usually, somebody once told me, political theory is nothing more than the rationalization of economic self-interest. Well, one of the biggest areas that is right now is the rapid urbanization of the world. So we can talk about a lot of issues involving access to water, which is critical for agriculture. But politics is going to determine a lot of these questions. Who loses, who gains, and whether we can all gain or not. So if you have rapid urbanization and you're going to move from maybe 85 and 90% of the people living off farms, maybe even higher, you can really see the political clash. We've seen it to some extent in our country with water rights. But politics and knowing how to exercise political rights in countries is going to be awfully key to solving a lot of the problems that we're talking about today and working within the system to get that done.
Very insightful. Doug, you have expertise in Asia, and a lot of the conversations when we talk about U.S. leadership vis-a-vis other types of leaders, we often end up talking about China. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Chinese influence on the discussion of development, their activities, and how that should be influencing our thinking about U.S. support.
I'm glad you're asking this question. You know, I think it's important that democracies take the lead and continue having a leading role in development and in food security, rather than an authoritarian government. And too many countries today, because the U.S. perhaps has stepped back a little bit in its international leadership, maybe be reasserted by the Congress, I think, they're looking at the Chinese model for development. And I look at the Chinese model working in Asia as well as sub-Saharan Africa as exploitive. And I just want them to see how the private and the public sector can work very effectively in a democracy and using the advantages of the non-governmental area as well. And with our amazing asset in our land-grant institutions and other research institutions, I think we have an opportunity really to do some dramatic things on some of the innovation that needs to take place in food science, in technology, and so many other areas. So I want the world to recognize that this leadership is coming out of democracies in the United States, Europe, Australia, Japan, and not from authoritarian models.
Well, and I guess it's worth commenting, I'll come to you in a second, Ivo, but worth commenting that China surpassed U.S. investment in public R&D several years ago, and we really likely need to be looking at that, which is part of what you're pointing to.
That's very troubling, and in fact, our R&D public expenditures had gone down for a period of time. They're back on the way up with a lot of support from the private sector, from the land-grant institutions, and from citizens who understand that it's important to have that R&D activities because there are benefits to the United States directly as well as abroad.
And I would just point out Brazil has surpassed us in public agriculture research, R&D, in large part because we taught them how to do it. Now, there's no problem with that as long as it's shared and the data is not restricted and people aren't stealing the intellectual property of other people who are doing that research. And we are also looking out after our own and under the Hippocrates line, physician, heal thyself, as long as we're adequately funding those things internally.
Ivo.
Just echoing something that Doug said that I think is very important, and particularly if the United States is starting to move, withdraw, retrench a little bit, and the opening that is being found by China, the question is, if it's not the U.S. and we don't want China to do it, who is going to step in? And here there is actually an interesting and good story. 80% of the OECD dollars on humanitarian and foreign aid gets spent by countries outside the United States. 9 countries in total: Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan, the EU, plus the 4 big European countries spend 80% of OECD foreign aid so far. So that includes the US. So the totality of money that is available from those countries is significant. And they do share with us a sense of values. They share with us an idea about how it is that you invest in people rather than exploit the people, which tends to be the more Chinese model that we've seen. And so if it's not the United States that is going to take the lead, it has to be countries like Japan and Australia and the European Union, Canada, very important actor in this sphere, who, in fact, collectively could have more weight even than the United States if it gets pushed in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And Germany's been taking a big lead in global
Germany
food security in recent
key
years
part
as
of
well.
that.
And, yeah. Well, I have a question that relates to next year. So 2020 is a big year. The Council has talked about the 2008 story in part about seizing a moment, which was the presidential election. We also do the long-term kind of building of champions in Congress along with others here. But what do you think we need to be thinking about as 2020 comes around? What's the landscape for opportunity? How do we seize upon moments to create new ideas or new vision? How should this community and the Council specifically be thinking about that? I don't know if any of you want to start.
Well, this was not part of the advanced questions, so how are we going to answer this? But it makes for good students, I guess, or good teachers. You know, first of all, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of the stuff we've done before is still very relevant.
Yeah.
You know, after all, soil quality, water quality, women's rights, youth bulge, all those things, nutrition. But one of the issues that does concern me in the modern era is the issue of governance. That is the role of free markets, the role of free societies, the role of the rule of contracts, so that there's a legitimacy to a private sector that can move goods, and that, of course, relates to the role of governments helping on the research side of the picture. But governance worries me because we seem to be at a period where not every country is moving in the positive direction on freedom and liberty. And, you know, without being too judgmental about it, that does affect agriculture and food production, because if we don't have adequately free markets and a free governance society, then there's no way that agriculture can sustain itself and feed a world of 9.5 or 10 billion people.
Yeah.
So that would be one thought I'd have.
Focus on governance. That's good.
I'd like to see us consider our role potentially in strengthening the multilateral African institutions. I think it's important that those continue to grow in their significance. You know, Africa does not feed itself. It doesn't come close to it all. It has capacity to do that. And one of the problems is the border problems within Africa itself, the trade barriers that are set up among African countries. And I think stronger African institutions could address that problem. I'd also think maybe they will focus more on trying to keep some of that great natural resource wealth that is in Africa from ending up in Swiss banks, and put more of it in the development of their own countries.
Thank you. Ivo, you've been in a number of presidential administrations, or at least Clinton administration, and ambassador under Obama.
I mean, I think one of the things we need to do is to preserve the gains that we have already made. And I'd start off with the two gains, and start off with Dan and Doug opening comments. One is to make sure that this issue stays high in any presidential administration's agenda, and that it doesn't get pushed aside. And I think and particularly because of what's happening in Africa and population growth, it is only going to be more important as an issue. And secondly, to maintain it as a bipartisan effort. It's one of those few areas that doesn't appear in the front page of the New York Times and is never discussed on Fox News or MSNBC, and that's a good thing. Because when you
watch those all the time? You watch those shows?
Well, I'm told. Because or on Twitter. It's just not. It's not necessarily. It's not politicized, and therefore it doesn't. It gets serious discussion and serious attention. And so I think the important thing is not to make it a partisan issue, to make sure that it stays as a nonpartisan issue. It's hard to find nonpartisan issues in U.S. politics, or indeed in politics in most of our Western countries today, and make sure that it stays on the top of the agenda. I think that's job one for how we get through 2020. Of course, 2020 is not like 16, let alone 2008, where you had two candidates vying for an empty office. In this case, you will have a re-election campaign, which always makes it.
It is important to remember that two of the great achievements of President Bush and President Obama were legacy items for them. The PEPFAR initiative was transformational. You know, I don't agree with everything George W. Bush did, but I tell you what, he and his administration saved hundreds of thousands of lives. That's a legacy that any president since the history of this country can be proud of. And President Obama carried that forward with the addition of the Feed the Future and the agriculture efforts. And it would be nice if the next president, whoever that person he or she may be, would be able to build on those legacies.
Absolutely.
You know, I think the Council's work in the past has identified to some extent already the youth bulge that exists in South Asia and especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. It deserves more attention because with the median age of all the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa except one under 24 and some of them under 18, about 13, this is a huge number of young people who are out there who need to have opportunities for employment. And some of that will come by better serving the services and technology for the food chains that come to these expanding mega cities out there. So I think maybe continued emphasis on trying to make sure that there are employment opportunities that are coming to those areas and to those young people growing up in Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and also South Asia.
Yeah, great point to end on, and we're going to talk about the future in the next panel, and I hope we can dig in a little bit more on that. Thank you all for the conversation, and the audience would mind thanking them.
Thank you. All right.